Good morning, guys, and welcome out to Revolution. So this is part 4 of our Byzantine school. So this is a series dedicated to the scholarly study of biblical and secular Greek texts, the Textus Receptus, church history, and the legacy of influential scholars. And so I did announce in a few previous videos that I had a bit of a revelation that I think will help our cause with understanding the Textus Receptus, understanding the manuscripts that we rely upon, and understanding what Erasmus had access to. And so in some of the history that we learn, oftentimes there are certain dates in time where we think that things change. There's a paradigm shift. Mindsets are changed, like something like 9/11. Now, regardless if you think 9/11 was important or not, regardless of, there was, up to 3,000 people who died on 9/11. But some people say, well, compared to, some of the wars that we've had in the last 20 years, where 1 million people have died, obviously that's way worse, sort of thing. But sometimes the cause and effect of an issue, of a historical moment, can cause ramifications that are huge around the world. So obviously everyone felt the ramifications of something like COVID. Everyone felt the ramifications of 9/11. Now, during church history, there are certain periods of time where we usually mark these periods of time as epochs in history. And so we might look at, say, the Reformation, Martin Luther, 1517. That would be coming up, actually, because usually Halloween is tied in with that date of Halloween. But, certain periods of time, obviously, we're looking at bibliology. So 1611 is a type of epoch where we believe, as Textus Receptus advocates, at the final edition of the Textus Receptus, the accumulation, culmination of all the scholarship up to that period was funneled into that edition. And that's why we believe the King James is so important, because it's not just a translation of an English text. It's actually the final edition of the Textus Receptus. Now, more accurately would be the underlying text is the final text. Now, Beza came very close to that text in 1598. The other Textus Receptus editions are not that far from it, but obviously we believe it was a progression. And so one main period of time also is in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople is something in our mind where we understand that the Greek scholars fled Constantinople. Today that's known as Istanbul in Turkey. The Muslims took over that part of the world. They took over the Hagia Sophia. They turned it into a mosque. They've basically ruled that area of the world for the last 400, or I guess almost 600 years. And so that's just the history of that part of the world. And we see that as a defining moment of when biblical scholarship in Europe was based mostly around Latin. But then we do see a few pockets of Greek, but then we see a flood of Greek manuscripts, a flood of Greek scholars coming over from that. But at the same time, we also see the printing press being invented. I guess the Chinese had invented that a long time before, but the concept in Europe, it was quite new. And so Gutenberg's press in 1454, that was quite a huge revolution that happened. And so one thing that in my mind, usually I try and keep dates and facts and figures, and I look at like post Because oftentimes people say, "Oh, where was the Bible before 1611?" And so you've got to have these type of answers. It's like, well, all the words of God were in the text of Beza for the New Testament, but they were in Greek and Latin, and they weren't. Most of the words were in the text, but there was about 20 differences in the margins, and so that's why the King James translators looked at all those issues. And some of those, they believed that the case for what was in the margin was stronger, and so they went with those readings. And so they actually did textual criticism in about 20 places, which is quite a few, in a sense where, quite a few, quite a minority. It's a very few smattering of readings compared to the size of the Bible, and compared to like the text, even the majority text, or the text of the critical text, that they do have quite a lot of differences. Say even Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, just the differences between them, 3,000 in the Gospels, just alone in the Gospels, 3,000 differences. We're talking about 20 differences between Beza and the King James. So, but it warrants the King James to be called its own Textus Receptus edition. So the underlying Greek text of the King James is slightly different to Beza. But we're looking at 99.99% between that and 99.98%. 99.99% is about 14 readings, where 99.98% is about 27 readings. And so it's somewhere between those, which is, we're splitting hairs. But people say, where was the Bible before 1611? I said, well, I always just point out there was a new technology that came on the scene called printing, and it just took quite a while for it to get to the stage where everything was in one place between two covers. And so that's what happened with the King James. Now, had they done that in the German language, I would go, well, that's where it happened. Had they done it in the French language, that's where it would have happened. But they did it in English. It just so happened to be in English. The 60 scholars that worked on that, they were top-notch. They knew what they were doing. They weren't ignorant. They looked at the original languages. They looked at all the previous English editions, and they looked at all the other language editions. So they looked at everything. And they worked on their text. They did a very good job at this. And so then you look at post 1611. So 1611 becomes quite an important date for people to work around. Now, this what I'm going to talk about today is a date which most people would just see as something really obscure. But I believe that this is probably going to become one of the most discussed dates after I bring this information out, because it's almost like this type of information has been forgotten in the field of textual criticism, in the field of manuscript collection, in the field of understanding the world that Aldous, Erasmus, and the early reformers were in. And so that date is 1527. Now, usually around that era, I've got, 1514, the Complutensian Polyglot, 1516, Erasmus's first edition, even Tyndale's 1525 edition, all those sort of dates in my mind. But the 1527 was the sack of Rome. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the sack of Rome, and I didn't realize how much Rome was devastated. It was almost completely wiped off the map. It's such a huge thing that happened in Rome that you basically, when you go through just the bog standard articles online, you're looking at the history of Rome, a timeline, the sack of Rome is like the end of an era. It's the end of the Renaissance. So you have pre-1527 Rome, and you have post 1527 Rome. You have a period of time where so many manuscripts were destroyed that Erasmus had access to, Aldous had access to, the Renaissance had access to, that would, after the sack of Rome, just no one knows where they are. They're gone. They're destroyed. Libraries were burnt down. So we're looking at a 9/11 type of moment for Rome. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And I believe that if you just stick with me through this video, you'll see why I believe this is such an important thing and why this will become a main topic of conversation concerning the biblical text. Because a lot of people say, oh, Erasmus has this reading. Where's the manuscript for that? And oftentimes we're pointing out that people like Dan Wallace have said, in World War II alone, there were 1 million biblical documents that were destroyed. Now, he said that in the Credo course. And so I've often repeated that. Now, people are like, well, what was destroyed? How do you know? And all this sort of stuff. Well, when you look at, if Dan Wallace, who is considered one of the world leading experts on biblical documents, now I don't agree with his critical text position, but I do think that he does know about manuscripts. And he says that these manuscripts were destroyed, let alone in World War One, let alone in many of the European wars. And as we'll see, this was a huge issue in Rome. And so we're going to look at some of this. And so I'll just see what's happening in the chat. Boulder's a lion. He's in the house. So sorry if I've got a bit of a sniffle here. I don't think it's actually like a flu-y thing. I think it's just in Pakistan, where I was in the last 3 weeks, there is so much dust. I actually looked up on a website where it said that it was 170 points or something, which was highly toxic, and it was like smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. And so my wife's voice had blown out, and I was actually fine until I got back, and I've just been blowing my nose ever since. But I think it's just a dust thing. And so Shall Stand Forever is in the house. And so what we're going to do, I'm just going to show you a few things. So obviously I'm not going to go into many books and things that aren't really readily available, but I'm just going to show you some bog standard things like Wikipedia. So obviously we have the sack of Rome here, 1527. Now we know that there was an earlier sack of Rome that happened in 410. So we know that was obviously not related to this one. But this sack of Rome, it's called the sack of Rome mostly because, well, Rome did rebuild. And what we see with the fall of Constantinople is that they were taken over, and basically the Byzantine kingdom there was shifted out and the Muslims moved in. And so that's one of the differences, where this sack of Rome, it was invaded, and lots of people were killed during that time. The whole bunch of manuscripts were burnt, a whole bunch of priests were killed. This type of thing happened, but then people left and they rebuilt. And so that would be the difference between something like the fall of Constantinople. But I believe it's still a very strong thing that happened. It's a very important thing. So this caused an end to the golden age of the Renaissance. So basically the Renaissance, mostly focused around Florence, but it spread to Rome, it spread to all of Italy and pretty much to all of Europe, Venice and Vienna and many other places. But the Renaissance in Rome was huge, and it was focused around biblical documents. Yes, they had Roman Catholicism there with relics, with icons, with, if you've ever watched that Luther movie, Luther does quite a good job at talking about, they've got enough nails from the cross to, shoe every horse in Saxony sort of thing. But we do know that when something like this happens, there is treasure lost. The destruction of Jerusalem, 70 AD. Us as Christians, we understand the importance of this. We understand the Jews, that they were scattered. That there was just a huge issue that happened with that. The fall of Constantinople, obviously, is something that we also look at as historians. But just think for a moment, the city's population of Rome was over 55,000 people before the sack of Rome. Afterwards, it was 10,000. It doesn't mean everyone died. A lot of people fled. So it's estimated between 6,000 and 12,000 people were murdered. So you're looking at people, some people drowned, some people try to get away in the rivers. But so you're looking at the population going from 55,000. So just picture wherever you live in the world, a town of about 55,000. And imagine going back there and there's only 10,000 people there. And the vast majority of the place is burnt down. That's what happened. And that's why it's so important to know and understand this, because a lot of people, they make out that the manuscripts that we have in our hand today, the extant manuscripts, are sort of like all that we've ever had, where oftentimes we're pointing out that through flood, through fire, through war, through theft, I don't think that we have any idea of what Erasmus really had access to. And so in my interview with Heffernan Jones, I was throwing out some ideas. Now, sometimes I just come up with an idea and I'm like say the whole concept of Erasmus not seeing Vaticanus. I just kept hearing people say, well, he never went and saw Vaticanus. And it's like, well, how do you know that? And so I'd just question that. And I just kept not getting answers. And it just gets to the point where it's like, well, actually, he could have seen it, and you're just like, yeah, well, if there's no real evidence against it, there's a possibility that he did see it. The whole concept of that we've been looking at with Aldus Manutius being the printer that was printing Erasmus's material. Erasmus stayed with him for 9 months, was a proofreader in his print shop. He ran the Byzantine school. So that's what I've named this series after, because we want to look at what these guys have done, but we want to look at the historical context that these people lived in. And so Cardinal Bessarion, who had thousands of documents in Greek, was a Greek scholar, was just an absolute legend in his time. He donated all of his manuscripts to a place in Venice, and they're still there to this day. And Erasmus was just down the road from there. He lived there for 9 months. He could have accessed this at any time. And understanding how important Erasmus was, he was one of Europe's leading scholars, to the point where they actually called him the Prince of the Humanists. He knew all about the Renaissance literature. He was the leading expert in Latin, and he became the leading expert in Greek. And so his importance, it's sort of like, out of all the scientists, if you had Albert Einstein's coming to visit our facility, you're like, he's coming here? Wow, you wouldn't just go, no, we're not going to let him on our campus, sort of thing. When Erasmus came to a place, people valued his presence, they valued his opinions, they valued his scholarship, his learning. And for him not to visit Cardinal Bessarion's collection, it's almost like it would be a strange anomaly of history if he didn't. That he's living in Venice, just down the road is this huge collection of Bessarion's manuscripts. Let alone Aldus Manutius. Aldus Manutius was living in Venice for quite a long time. He knew the upper echelon of Venice, the intellectuals of Venice, and as if one of their greatest treasures is just locked away and no one can go there. So it was interesting to talk to Heffernan about those things, and just sort of, I was asking questions, but even just in asking those questions, I'm left with 15 more questions. I'm just sort of, it's like you open up a Pandora's box. So back to the sack of Rome. So it's sort of like the 9/11 of the Renaissance. It's the end of an era. When you look at this timeline of Rome, so I was just checking this. So you got, your early Rome, etc. 1410, Rome sacked. The king of the Visigoths sacks Rome. we go through the Middle Ages, but then when we go through the Renaissance, we look through this period of time. Basically, apart from Michelangelo, being an architect for the Basilica, 1527 is sort of like one of the last things that sort of occurs in this period. The troops of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, attack Rome, looting and ruining the city. Okay, so we would have to think that there is a mark in the historical territory here. 1527, this is like, say, the Great Fire of London that happened in 1666. 437 acres of London burnt to the ground. Now, when you're studying King James history material, a lot of that material got burnt in the Fire of London. They actually had in Guildford's Hall, they had a museum set up, designed so that people could go in and learn all about the work of the translators, learn all about the documents they used and things like that. But that was burnt to cinders. It's just ash, and so a huge treasure is just gone. But thankfully, books have spread around, and people, historians have unturned things and found things, and so we are able to piece together a few bits of information here and there. But even then, like, people are like talking about the 1602 Bod, the Bishop's 1602 Bod edition from the Bodleian Library. And I was talking to Chris Yetzer the other day, and he said, look, I believe that was actually after 1611. So people are saying that was one of the documents that the 1611 guys used. Someone was saying it's actually written afterwards. And so, that's the problem, is sometimes we're finding things saying, well, now we've got a little bit of information, but people aren't hugely definitive on exactly what that information is. And it takes a while for things to get ironed out. And sometimes, too, people who have a bias against the King James Version, they just claim, well, this is this and this is that. I've seen people do that. I've seen people claim that there are editions of Beza in 1611 that override all these other editions. And, after Beza died, all his, the guys who printed his text, they didn't like his readings, so they printed another one without these readings in it. And it's like, so I did my own investigation and realized they actually just printed an earlier edition, which was quite common because people wanted a whole set. If someone had done 5 editions, they wanted the first, second, third. They wanted these older editions as well, so they could see where they had moved away from things. Just like we become fascinated with the Geneva and the bishops and the Coverdale, and we want them, but we probably wouldn't use them in a public setting or something like that. It's just for study. So yeah, like the 1666 Fire of London, huge loss to London. And that caused massive problems for like 100 years for London. And so the sack of Rome in 1527 was a brutal and chaotic event with significant cultural, political, and religious consequences. It's often seen as the major turning point in the Renaissance and in the power dynamics of Europe. The sack, led by the mutinous troops of Emperor Charles V, primarily mercenaries, many whom were actually Lutheran, which is quite interesting. Now, when I say they're Lutheran, I'm not saying they're following the teachings of Luther. I'm saying that they have been converted against Catholicism and they've joined the broad political Lutheran movement. So it resulted in the widespread destruction and looting of Rome, deeply affecting the city's people, its religious institutions, and its vast cultural heritage, including the Vatican Library. Okay, so this goes deep. Okay, Bold as a Lion is chatting here, loving what's happening. So the sack of Rome, 1527, on the 6th of May. So how do you remember this date? Well, sometimes when May the 4th comes along, the Star Wars fans are like, "May the Fourth be with you." You know, it's like sort of like a joke that it's been around for 10 years, and you sort of got to laugh at that when people say it just to be polite. But so on May the 5th, the following day, the troops entered to attack Rome. On May the 6th, they entered into Rome. So it's sort of like the day after, May the 4th be with you sort of thing. So this is in 1527. So I want people to remember these dates and how I would remember them. You know, because sometimes you're on the fly and you're trying to think of things, and you eventually on May the 4th and 5th, 6th, okay. And so there was a lot of tension between Pope Clement VII of the Medici family. A very good and interesting study that we will look into is the history of the Medicis. The Medicis were the bankers of Europe. They financed a lot of the wars. They financed a lot of the projects, building projects and things that were happening, the arts. And they eventually realized that there was power in the Roman Catholic Church. And so some of the popes were Medicis. And so this is quite interesting. So Pope Clement the Seventh of the Medici family and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor's troops, which included disgruntled unpaid mercenaries, many of them Lutheran, besieged and entered Rome. They stormed Rome. Despite being nominally under the emperor's command, the troops had little restraint. Once they entered the city, they looted and destroyed with little regard of life and property. Pope Clement VII was forced to take refuge in Castel Sant'Angelo, where he watched helplessly as the city was ravaged. The sack resulted in the deaths of thousands of Romans, with widespread plundering and desecration of churches, monasteries, palaces, and libraries. The sack also had a profound religious significance, as many of the attackers were Lutherans who saw the Roman Church as corrupt, and they took great pleasure in looting its wealth and desecrating its symbols. The looting of libraries and churches was widespread. The sack of Rome led to the widespread destruction of cultural and religious institutions, including libraries. The Vatican Library, which had grown considerably under popes like Julius II and Leo X, were not spared. Although some manuscripts survived by being hidden or smuggled out of the city, many were lost, looted, or destroyed. Now, just think about that for a second. So here you have Erasmus, Aldous, before this happened. They had access to these manuscripts that afterwards were not in existence. So when people are like, oh, where do we find this manuscript? Why did Erasmus use this reading? Why did he do that? Well, could it be that he had access to a bunch of manuscripts that we no longer have access to? This is one of the things that we as Textus Receptus people quite often bring up, and we just experience pushback. But I think that clearly, just looking at history, we know that this is true. We know that obviously, if the Great Fire of London happened in Guildford Hall, that history of the King James Bible is gone. We're looking at fragmentary information, and sometimes, like I'm saying, people are still contesting over whether this is, an old book or it's written later on or whatever. People are still arguing over these things. There's uncertainty about certain things. So this is what happens when history gets destroyed. We know for a fact when Luther I shouldn't really liken Luther to Hitler. I meant to say Hitler, but Luther came out. Hitler, when he went into Paris, we know that Goebbels had trains going day and night back into Germany, filled with art, filled with gold, filled with all sorts of treasures. This is just what happens. This is what happened. I mean, Look at what happened when Iraq was invaded. George Bush has said, go in there, mission accomplished, and all that sort of stuff. But the amount of antiquities, museums just looted, and then all of a sudden, all this material is on the black market. Some of the oldest treasures that they've had in the world, in the Mesopotamian region, they're just gone. they're missing now in time because the soldiers were protecting the oil. The American soldiers were protecting the oil refineries, but not the museums, and so they just got looted. So the Vatican Library was not spared. So some manuscripts ended up in private collections across Europe or were irretrievably lost. This had a devastating impact on the preservation of knowledge, including biblical and theological texts. So just think about that for a moment. So some manuscripts were, smuggled, they were hidden, they were smuggled out of the city, but most were lost or destroyed. So it's unclear how many specific Bible manuscripts were destroyed or looted. The Vatican Library's collection of Greek and Latin texts, including manuscripts of the Church Fathers and the Bible, suffered, given that the library housed valuable Greek New Testament manuscripts and early copies of the Vulgate. Their destruction or removal would have been a significant loss to biblical scholarship. So Erasmus, Aldous, the scholars who worked in before the sack of Rome had access to a lot more manuscripts than after the sack of Rome. That everyone would just see that as a clear distinction. So this is why I think 1527 is going to become a bit of a speed hump for critical text advocates who are going to say, well, why is this reading there? We only have it in one manuscript. James White, we only have it in one manuscript, this one Textus Receptus reading. He doesn't want to look at his readings, which, there are multiple places where there's only just one manuscript has the reading. But when you think about it, 1527, Rome is pretty much destroyed. So the scholars who worked in Rome before that, they were from a different era. They saw and looked at different manuscripts that we no longer have in existence. The decline of Rome as a center of Renaissance learning occurred. So before the sack of Rome in 1527, Rome was the hub of the Renaissance, the hub of scholarship, the place where people went to learn, to study, and to look at manuscripts. And there were manuscript collectors. They were printing many of these manuscripts. They were trying to, decipher the best manuscripts, looking at doing the works of text criticism, proper text criticism, with the Bible, with the early church writers, with some of the Greek classics, Roman classics, etc. The sack of Rome effectively ended Rome's role as the intellectual and cultural center of the Renaissance. Scholars, artists, and theologians who had gathered in the city under the papal patronage fled in the wake of the destruction, and the city took years to recover. Many of these scholars, who might have been working on or studying biblical manuscripts, were displaced or even killed. So this dispersal also delayed the Roman Catholic Church's efforts to engage in theological and biblical scholarship, as the aftermath of the sack shifted the focus toward rebuilding and defense. So here you have a culture focused on biblical manuscripts, focused on scholarship. Here you have Erasmus right in the middle of this. Then you have the sack of Rome, and the church, not only, this is the end of the Renaissance period for Rome. This is just the end of that period. It's a paradigm shift also, where people no longer have the money or the time to just look at manuscripts. They have to rebuild their city. They have to build defenses and just, get back to, from a post-war situation. They have to rebuild their whole city. So obviously the scholars who were before this had a much better access. And now, I guess it's like, having, the British Library burned down, or the Bodleian Library burned down, or something like that. This was a huge thing that happened. I mean, the sack of Rome can be compared to other famous moments in cultural and intellectual loss in history. So we've looked at, the fire of London, fall of Constantinople, etc. Well, I've mentioned them, but let's just look at, say, the Library of Alexandria. So the exact circumstances surrounding the destruction of the Library of Alexandria are debated. So there's actually a very interesting podcast. I might even just look it up now. It is Fire of Alexandria Atheists YouTube. This one here, the Great Library. Now, these guys are atheists, but they actually do an amazing job at going through and debunking the claims of other atheists that the library was destroyed by Christians who didn't like the pagan books that were written there. So they just go through and say, no, the Library of Alexandria, it took quite a long time for it to be destroyed. There were certain parts of the museum. It was such a big museum that sometimes they would, during like 150-year period, they'd have a fire that burnt some of the library. Then they'd rebuild it, and then another fire would happen, or a flood, or then they'd have an invading army come in and loot the place. And so this happened over hundreds and hundreds of years. So the whole concept of it being just looted and destroyed by the Christians, that's ridiculous. So they have the Great Library Part 1. So this is history for atheists. So it's not from a Christian perspective. They might, swear and stuff in these, but it's actually quite intellectual. I'll just play you a tiny little bit so you can get a bit of a taste for it. Where are we here?
Afterwards, the appearance of the empty shelves excited the regret and indignation of every spectator whose mind was not totally darkened by religious prejudice. The compositions of ancient genius.
And so they have quotations. They have quite a lot of things. This is by Gibbon. So Gibbon, he was an interesting historian. He actually wrote against 1 John 5:7, but he does have the history and of the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire. But I just thought I'd show you that just to do with the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, because that wasn't just a once-off event. There was like a continuous expansion of the library, and then sometimes it was looted, burnt. Then there was other periods of expansion, and so and that helps too, because the text that usually is talked about a lot is the Alexandrian text, and so it's good to know what people had access to and things like that in history. And so it's often seen as one of the greatest losses of knowledge in the ancient world. Like the sack of Rome, the destruction of the Library of Alexandria meant the loss of countless manuscripts and texts, many of which were unique and irreplaceable. Both events marked the end of significant centers of learning, Alexandria for the ancient world and Rome for the Renaissance. So the 1527 sack of Rome is considered the end of the Roman Renaissance. Okay. The 1566 Great Fire of London destroyed much of the city, including libraries, churches, institutions of learning. Although this fire did not have the same direct political and military causes as the sack of Rome, the cultural impact of the loss of manuscripts and records was similar and just as devastating. The fire also delayed intellectual and artistic growth in the city, just as did the sack of Rome. I guess another another thing just came to my mind, but it just went out. It went in one ear and went out the other ear. So I'll keep reading and it'll come back to me. The fall of Constantinople, we talked about this. The Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople. Another massive center of Greek and Christian scholarship was lost. Like the sack of Rome, this event led to the looting and destruction of churches, libraries, cultural artifacts. Many scholars fled to the West, bringing with them valuable manuscripts, which ironically helped fuel the Renaissance in Italy. However, in both cases, the immediate aftermath was of cultural and intellectual devastation. And so I do remember what I was going to say. This also happened in England when Henry VIII said, we are going to be a Protestant church. And many of the Roman Catholic churches were taken over and some of them were looted. Some of their books were thrown out, and in this type of frenzy, there was looting. And so a lot of manuscripts just walked and they're gone. So what's interesting is Erasmus also had access to manuscripts in England before this happened in Henry VIII's day. So that's quite interesting as well. So he not only had access to what Italy had before this 1527 sack of Rome, but he also had access to documents that were in England before Henry VIII in, I think it was 1535, before he basically announced that they were now a Protestant nation. So World War II and the destruction of European libraries is something that Dan Wallace has talked about. So in World War II across Europe, whether from bombings or looting, it bears a semblance to the sack of Rome in the scale of cultural loss. Many priceless works of art, books, manuscripts were either destroyed or lost to private collectors, much like what happened in Rome in 1527. The sack of Rome was one of the most traumatic events in the early 16th century, and its importance can be understood on several levels. So it was the end of the Renaissance in Rome, the end of a period. The Renaissance had been in full bloom under popes like Julius II and Leo X. The sack marked the end of this cultural flourishing in Rome, and the city would never again be the center of the Renaissance as it once was. Many artists, scholars, and humanists fled the city, and some, like Erasmus, even became more critical of the corruption and moral decay they saw in the church. So that's interesting. There was a shift in power dynamics. So the sack of Rome symbolized the weakening of papal authority, the rise of secular rulers, specifically Charles V. It also showed the vulnerability of the papacy and the church at a time when the Protestant Reformation was gaining ground in Northern Europe. So a lot of the Protestants, although they wouldn't agree with murder, and like you just read people like Beza and these others, although I wouldn't agree with him siding with Calvin and what happened with some of the issues with him. But Beza was obviously pacifistic. He was against war and things like that. And so, and I think most of the Lutherans were as well. I think that a lot of these people were just Lutheran by name. It just basically became, if you weren't a Roman Catholic, well, what are you then? You're a Lutheran, So this really impacted the Roman Catholic Church. The sack deeply humiliated the papacy and led to a period of introspection and reform. So that's why oftentimes people will talk about the Reformation period. Well, the Roman Catholic Church after this went, okay, let's reform. That's when they had the Council of Trent and basically doubled down on a whole bunch of things, became extremely violent with the Jesuits, with Ignatius Loyola and others. And they basically started the Counter-Reformation, which was very brutal. And so, this reform would culminate in the Council of Trent that was in 1545 to 1563. The losses in terms of religious manuscripts and cultural heritage also delayed the church's ability to respond intellectually to the Reformation. So here we have the Reformation exploding through Europe, exploding through Germany, through England, France, many places around Europe, which were Catholic strongholds. And then you see 1527, Rome is burnt to the ground. And so what you have then is the Spaniards sort of coming up to the plate, and, they were running the Spanish Inquisitions, and they, pulled Erasmus over the coals and had the, the council, the Valladolid, I think it's called, Valladolid Council, where they went through Erasmus's material to see whether he was a Trinitarian or not. It was like a witch hunt. And so they went through a lot of his material to see if he was promoting Arianism, which is quite an interesting bit of history that we will look at. But that happened in 1527 as well. So it's sort of like it's moved, the whole issue of how do we respond to the Reformation is moved from Rome, and Spain has sort of picked up that baton. The loss of biblical and classical manuscripts was huge. The works on the early church writers, it was a major setback for scholarship. The looting of the Vatican Library and other institutions meant that many ancient works were lost or taken by private collectors. And so it's further fragmented the historical record. It hindered these type of biblical scholars for years. But people like Erasmus and Aldous had access to these before this had occurred. So that's one of the things where I think that you can't just wave your hand and just make 1527 sack of Rome go away. Someone like James White, people like Jan Kranz, other people who basically are saying that where are the Textus Receptus manuscripts that back up this reading and that reading? Why did Erasmus have this choice of reading? Well, he had access to a whole world of manuscripts, scholarship, the peak of the Renaissance, right at the end of the Renaissance period. And after that, a lot of that evidence has just disappeared. And so that's why. And so thankfully, in the providence of God, God had these men in these places of scholarship before this occurred, to look at the early church writers. I mean, if you look at the beginning of Erasmus's text, I'll just get Erasmus up here. Erasmus. Look at Wikipedia. If you look at the beginning of his text, you can clearly see the depth of his scholarship. So I'll just see if I can find it here. Okay, that's the Aldine Press. Visit to England. Now maybe I can type in Greek, or even that comment there basically said, as a Catholic priest developing humanist techniques for working on text, he prepared pioneering new Latin and Greek scholarly editions of the New Testament and of the Church Fathers, with annotations and commentary that were immediately and vitally influential on both the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Reformation. So through these men looking at all this information, they became the storehouse that while the manuscripts were destroyed, these guys were saying, we've looked at those manuscripts. Here is the conclusion. And so it's very important. Okay, now I'm just looking for the Aldine New Academy. That's sort of what we're basing our academy upon. Advanced Greek. Okay, let's just go through this. Okay, here we are. He's 1516 Greek New Testament. Let's have a look at that. So even the Complutensian polyglot. So this is 2 years before Erasmus. Well, this is the Old Testament, so it's not the best example. But this is the Hebrew, this Greek Septuagint with a Latin commentary, Latin interlinear sort of thing, and then the Latin text in the middle, the Vulgate. So that's quite interesting. They basically finished their work. It was completely done in 1517, I'm pretty sure. So the conclusions that they had were based upon manuscripts from the Vatican Library. So we don't know which manuscripts were destroyed, which weren't. It's just an unknown thing. And that's why they can't find these. They're looking for these manuscripts. It's like, well, they probably will never find them. They could have been, wrapped in a bag, and someone's like, oh, this is valuable. And then they're killed, and no one knows what these things are, and they just get thrown into the river, or you burnt, or whatever, Okay. So here's the preface to Erasmus. I'm actually looking for the front page of his Greek. I'm just sort of hoping that I can find it here. Because many times he will mention, 5 or 6, early church writers just in the preface to his Greek New Testament. Here we go. So just looking at the Latin here, here we have the name Origen, Chrysostom, Cyril, Vulgari, Jerome, Cyprian, Ambrose. So this is the front of his Greek New Testament. So he had access to their writings. He had access to a whole bunch of manuscripts that we no longer have. 1527, they were gone. They're missing. They're no longer in existence. But they're summarized and kept in the domain of humanity by people like Erasmus, who were before the 1527 sack of Rome. And so that's the main point that I'm trying to bring across here. So the sack of Rome in 1527 was a catastrophic event that not only devastated the city physically, but also dealt a severe blow to its cultural and intellectual life. While it may not have been on the same scale as the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, the loss of manuscripts, including Bible texts, was significant and delayed progress in biblical scholarship. Much like other moments of cultural destruction, whether the burning of the Library of Alexandria or the Great Fire of London, the sack of Rome marked the end of a golden age of learning and set back human progress by destroying countless works of art and literature that can never be recovered. But we know that God had his people in there, his agents in there, gathering the important information that we needed. And that was presented to us in the editions of Erasmus and Aldus. And these were the basis of the Textus Receptus. So Avery F says, boom. So we've got a few people here. Brett's in the house. Avery F is in the house. Boulder's a Lion is living the dream. Sounds like our Gulf Coast after Helena and Milton. The beaches are just gone. Yeah. When you've seen something totally destroyed, it really does shake you up. And I guess, I'll just go through some more of this stuff. But what I really want to do as well, I want to play a clip. So I was going through some of the very interesting history of the sack of Rome. So I listened to this one here, but then I was listening through this one here, and between the 23-minute mark and the 40-minute mark, I felt like this needed to be played just so people could get an understanding of what happened there. Now, I'm not going to try and bore you with, who was who the popes were at this time, or who the cardinals were, or who even the invading army were, or anything. I just want to sort of play the part where it's like, well, this is the devastation that happened. This is how bad it got. And then we're going to look at some of the interesting things about Erasmus. Okay, so I'm going to play this. Hopefully it won't bore you to tears. This is read by an Australian guy who lives in London. So he runs this Anthology of Heroes podcast, which is quite an interesting historical podcast. So I would recommend that people, have a look at that. He's got quite a few very interesting bits of history and things like that. I've subscribed to him, but I felt like he explained it in a way that I would just be reading through this and it would get quite boring. So let's listen to what he has to say about this.
Family. He knew he was a marked man, but maybe he could have a day or two with his family before they found him. But the mob was hot on his trail, and in front of his wife and children, they seized him and bashed him to death. 42 of the Swiss guard ran the last meters of the passageway, flanking the pontiff to protect him from missiles. From below, the Pope would have heard the beginning and the pleading of a population who knew their death was coming soon. The Spaniards and the Germans had now reached the inner city, and the slaughter was beginning. With the Pope safely inside the fortress, his guardsmen gave the order to drop the gate. The metal gate fell with deadly force, impaling many people who had tried to force themselves inside. By the time the door shut, about 3,000 souls had crammed themselves into the tiny fortress. The door locked behind the Pope, and it would not open again for many, many months. Outside the citadel, the Landknechts began their butchery. Their first directive was to ensure the city was properly taken before they started looting. They needed the population cowed and subdued, and indiscriminate killing was the quickest way to do it. When they realized the Spaniard contingent of the army had already begun gathering hostages, they were furious. With the imminent threat of death finally having left them, factionalism split the conquering army quickly. But the first point of call for every one of the men was food. Quote, "The gaunt figures ate and ate until they could consume no more. Months of gruel, weak soup, and rancid vegetables, now they had their choice of anything." End quote. Once it was clear that the Swiss guards were gone, the Pope's lavish palace was sacked. Townsfolk who hid in churches were usually spared butchery post-siege, but not here. The polished floors of the city churches were soon slick with blood, and the pews piled high with corpses, people from all statuses, from labourers to bankers. For the nuns and the priests, death was preferable to falling into the hands of the Lutheran Protestants, because to the Protestants, they were chief instruments in promoting this corrupted, filthy version of their faith. Nuns were raped en masse and priests were tortured hideously. The Catholic faith was openly mocked as German soldiers forced priests to perform the sacrament ritual on a mule they dressed up in cardinal's clothing. When the man refused, he was killed on the spot. Another source speaks of Germans holding a type of macabre parade. A cardinal was forced into a coffin that the soldiers nailed shut, and while they sung a funeral song for him, the coffin was paraded through the streets to the drunk and jeering soldiers who blamed every crime imaginable on the entombed man. Other cardinals, well into their 80s, were forced to escort the entourage through the streets. A source describes the soldiers with gigantic pearls weaved into their beards, draped in velvet cloaks with fingers bulging with rings meant for smaller women's hands. Francesco Giacardini, a secondary source, tells us how these holy men were treated. Quote, "Many of these men wore torn and disgraceful habits," meaning clothes. Others were without shoes. Some in ripped and bloody shirts had cuts and bruises all over their bodies from the indiscriminate whippings and beatings they'd received. Some had thick and greasy beards. Some had their faces branded and were missing teeth. Others were without noses or ears. Some were castrated. End quote. The tombs of even the most venerated saints, we're talking St. Peter himself, were pried open. Their bones were wrenched from their sockets and smashed in search of jewels hidden behind them. Once any valuables were extracted, the heads of St. Peter and St. Paul, two of Jesus' apostles, were last seen being kicked around in the street for sport. In the midst of the blood and filth, an old nun managed to tuck away the head of John the Baptist, one of the holiest figures in Christianity, the man who baptized Jesus Christ. The enormous 1,200-year-old golden cross of Constantine the Great, the man who converted the Roman Empire to Christianity, was smashed into pieces and pulled apart for jewels. The Veronica cloth, a linen garment said to bear the face of Christ himself, was used to mop up beer in a local tavern. Nails that pierced Christ's flesh as he died on the cross, innumerable hands, fingers, and clothing belonging to saints. If these relics had no monetary value, they were destroyed purely on principle. The inner sanctum of churches, the holiest places, were turned into brothels as blood-drunk soldiers passed the time between murdering and looting. Monks and priests wept, not for their own fate, but for that of Rome. One cardinal remarked with great pity, quote, "Christians are doing what even the Turks never did," end quote. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, Cardinal Colonna, the Pope's old rival, arrived. With the city already fallen, his men wasted no time in joining in on looting. Although at first he was eager to twist the knife into his rival, it seemed like once he realized just how horrific this sack was, he tried to pull back. But it was too late. He'd already poured gasoline on the fire. An additional 8,000 men now rampaged through the Queen of Cities. As the smog and screams wafted into the richer part of Rome, Isabella d'Este looked nervously from the palace that she sheltered in. The woman had got herself in and out of some very hairy situations throughout her life, but even she would admit she was in over her head this time. As the dying light of the day and the fires throughout the city illuminated the collapsing buildings, she knew it was nightfall when the city was most dangerous. Suddenly, the yell of her guardsmen brought her back to reality. Her heart leapt as the shadows of figures came into view, snaking through the alleyways towards the palace. Her guardsmen instinctively raised their rifles, but as the first men came into view, she screamed at them to stand down. She recognized the figure leading them. It was her son, Ferrante. Isabella had not seen Ferrante for many years, and after a tearful embrace, he explained to his mother that the Duke of Bourbon was dead and that the Pope had fled to Castle de San Angelo. He told his mother that one of the Duke's final orders was for him and his men to defend the palace that she sheltered in. But Isabella's relief was short-lived as he continued by warning her that he had little control over any of the men apart from the small group that he'd brought with him. Factionalism had split the army into many different groups. There were Spanish, Italians, and both Catholic and Lutheran Germans prowling around, and his word would only go so far. He prepared his mother, saying that he could ensure her protection, but no one else that sheltered with her. If those inside could not pay a ransom, they would be on their own. The only safe place in the entire city was now Castle de San Angelo. From the battlements atop the castle, Pope Clement VII saw in vivid colour the catastrophe that he was responsible for. Since the time historians first began to write annals of the city, there have never been accounts of a sack so brutal. Even the Gothic boogeymen, Gaiseric and Alaric, neither of them had wounded the city so severely. The Pope stared, helpless, as one of his soldiers broke down crying, unable to open fire on a house where his wife and children lived. A group of drunken soldiers were on the cusp of breaking through the front door, and though the soldier knew what would happen once they got in, he couldn't bring himself to fire. As the mob broke down the door, another bombardier pushed the distraught man aside and fired the cannon, destroying the house and killing all those inside. At the barred gate, desperate civilians still gathered, begging to be allowed inside, and Clement watched as a half-dead cardinal was hauled up the side of the walls in a woven basket. For a man as pious as Clement, the horrific blend of laughter and tortured screams must have conjured thoughts of Judgment Day, the end of the world. A witness reports that over a skyline of smoke and red, the Pope raised his hands to the heavens and cried out, quote, "Quare de vulva edu existe me," end quote. Why did you bring me into this world? As the days dragged on, the easy plunder began. began to dry up. There were only so many big...
Oops, sorry, Hudson just pointed out I was muted. So I'm just going to play this clip for another 9 minutes. Now, but this is just giving us a taste of what's happening. So the population has gone from 55,000 down to 10,000, with approximately about 12,000 people murdered. So people are drowning in rivers. There's piles of bodies. There's priests, nuns, people are being raped, and they're digging up the graves of what's supposedly, Peter and Paul, and looking for jewels and treasures and things like that. They're smashing all the relics, looking for gold. And so what do you think's happening to all the biblical manuscripts during this time? During this time, they are looting. They are going through libraries. Anything of value, they're grabbing. And so just think about all the things that Erasmus had access to in Rome, that he would have looked at, that other scholars would have looked at and written about, and all the rest of it. Obviously, 1527 is the end of an era, and that those original documents that people always cry out about and say, oh, what did Erasmus have access to, and all the rest of it, a lot of these are just gone with time and with history.
Big crosses to break apart. And it was at this point that the remains of Bourbon's council tried to restore some order to the attackers. Usually, when a siege takes place, the standard time allotted to the sacking is 3 days. 3 days is usually considered enough time to let the soldiers' fury, excitement, and lust run its course. The new commander tried his best to re-establish authority, but was more or less told exactly where to shove that order. The army had fragmented so much now that securing the loyalty of a commander or two wasn't enough. The structure was just not there, and the occupation of the city had turned into thousands of little squads of men who barely tolerated the others, let alone accepted orders from them. Richer citizens usually had the option to pay a ransom, but that ransom only gave them protection from that specific creed of soldiers. If you paid your fortune to a Spanish group, the next day the Germans could come along saying, I don't care what your agreement was with them, you pay us now or else. Women of all statuses were raped repeatedly. Many times their mothers were forced to not only watch but join in, otherwise they'd both be killed on the spot. I won't go into more detail, but the assaults were just horrific, really cruel, sick stuff. Brothers that tried to intervene were murdered. Fathers were made to watch the defilement of their family members. The richest man in Rome, the guy who gave 100 ducats to the Pope for the defense of the city, was forced to watch the gang rape of his wife and daughters while soldiers burnt down their palace. As the mobs made their way up the streets, there are instances of fathers just murdering their daughters and wives rather than letting them fall into the hands of the attackers. A hospital was broken into, and all inside, many of them infants, were killed, with some just being thrown from windows into the streets. Occasionally, there were instances of women getting their revenge. When a group of soldiers chased down some local men into an alley, their wives, up in the second story, poured boiling water down on them before rushing them with meat cleavers and cudgels. As the weeks dragged on, so did the atrocities. Most of the richer citizens had been reduced to ruin or flat out murdered, so now the target shifted to the lower class. Sailors, fishermen, and labourers were tortured to reveal where they buried what little wealth they had. For those that had none to speak of, they needed to think on their feet. One man told his captors that all his wealth was buried out near the sea, so with his boat full of soldiers, he rowed them out into the Tiber River, and where the current was strongest, he dived off and swam to safety, leaving the Germans to drown in the river. Another story comes to us of a woman who convinced one of her rapists to have sex on a rickety table above a cesspit before pushing him into it midway through. But as the wealth of the Eternal City began to dry up, soldiers whispered of a source of untapped wealth. The rumor went that at the Colonna Palace there was a fabulously wealthy noblewoman hiding with her hundreds of the richest citizens in all of Rome. The woman, of course, was Isabella d'Este. In the days since the visit from her son, her position had become more difficult. Despite her armed guard and relation to both the dead commander and the current captain of the army, she had been forced to hand over many of the wealthier townsfolk sheltering with her. Crammed inside the palace, there were somewhere around 1,200 women and 1,000 men, totaling a whopping 2 million ducats of net worth. 2 other captains who were actually friends with her son awkwardly told him, "Hey, I'm sorry, I know she's your mum, but she and everyone else in there is a spoil of war. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Ferrante picked the former, and his armed guards supervised the payment ceremony to ensure order was maintained. These men had committed atrocities every hour, every day for weeks. If he had not been there, the fate of Isabella's guests could have been very different. Slowly, each noble was accounted for, and a price was decided based on their status. Isabella paid out of pocket for a couple of her close friends that were unable to find the funds, but others were on their own. They could try their hand at bargaining, but usually got them nowhere. So outside the ornate palace, blood-stained hands snatched greedily at the fat coin purses before the captive was shoved back inside or shooed into the streets. In the very first round of ransoms, 1/3 of what Bourbon had originally requested for the entire city was collected. Let that sink in, just how much pain could have been spared if a few of these people dug deep. Other little safe houses throughout the city were not as lucky, though. It was Ferrante's status in the army that ensured order, and without this safety net, it was the Wild West. Cardinals and noblemen alike tried to assert themselves, but discovered quickly that their position meant less than nothing in the fallen city. If the captive was too difficult, or even if they believed he was lying, they were tortured or murdered on the spot. And those with a family knew what would happen to their wife and kids after their death. One man who didn't have enough cash on hand wrote this desperate letter to his brother, begging him to get the money. Quote, "I am a prisoner of the Spaniards. They have fixed my ransom at 1,000 ducats on the pretext that I am an official. They have besides tortured me twice and finished by lighting a fire under the soles of my feet. For 6 days I had only a little bread and water. Dear brother, do not let me perish thus miserably. Get the ransom money by begging. For God's sake, do not abandon me. If I do not pay the ransom, now amounting to 140 ducats, in 26 days, they will hack me to pieces. For the love of God and of the Blessed Virgin, help me. All the Romans are prisoners, and if a man does not pay his ransom, he is killed. The sack of Genoa and of Rhodes was child's play to this. Help me, dear Antonio. Help me, for God's sake, and that as quickly as possible." End quote. With each day, things in the city got worse and worse. A good portion of the wealth had now left through the front gates. Those who had got the good stuff early on got out. Whoever was still around was now desperate to pick the corpse of the city clean. Ferrante grew concerned that the ransom his mother paid would soon be a distant memory, so late one night he smuggled her out. Dressed as a commoner, Isabella d'Este followed her son's soldier through the back streets of Rome, heading towards a small dinghy docked by the Tiber River. The city would have been barely recognizable. Almost no building was left unscathed. From the grandest church to the humblest home, the mob had turned it upside down looking for buried treasure. The stench was absolutely nauseating, the sickening smell of putrefying bodies mixed with mounds of feces. Bodies had been strung up in the streets with their arms tied behind the back, and men's testicles were found scattered throughout the streets, victims of torture which grew more extreme and bizarre by the day. An eyewitness writes of the horrors he witnessed, so imagine Isabella, a woman of the highest birth, darting through the back streets to this scene. Quote, "In Rome, the chief city of Christendom, no bells ring, no churches are open, no masses are said, Sundays and feast days have ceased. The rich shops of the merchants are turned into stables, the most splendid palaces are stripped bare, many houses are burnt to the ground, in others the doors and windows are broken and carried away. The streets are changed into dunghills. The stench of bodies is terrible. Men and beasts have a common grave, and in churches I have seen corpses that dogs have gnawed. In the public places, tables are set close together, at which piles of ducats are gambled for. The air rings with blasphemies, fit to make good men, if such there would be, wish they were deaf. I know nothing wherewith I can compare it, except it be the destruction of Jerusalem. I do not believe that if I lived for another 200 years, I should see the like again." End quote. Isabella reached the bank of the Tiber safely. The woman had lived a fantastical life, but as she boarded the creaking lifeboat and pushed off into the blackness, it's safe to say the things she had seen, heard, and smelt would be forever burned into her mind. She arrived safely at the port of Ostia, where she met her other son. Though few possessions made it out of the dead city, one did, and as she emerged from the boat, she presented her son with the cardinal hat she had promised him. Isabella was nothing if not a woman of her word.
Yeah, so I think you get the point. It's like Avery F just said, history sure is messy. Yeah, and I know that this obviously this is just secular. You know, I don't know who this guy is who does this podcast, and so they're saying, you know, Christians are doing this, blah blah blah. So obviously, anyone who does this type of thing is just simply not a Christian. But back to Erasmus and Aldus Manutius definitely had an advantage by studying and working in Rome before the sack of 1527. Rome, during their time, was one of the key intellectual and cultural centers of the Renaissance, with unmatched access to classical text, scholars, resources that were severely disrupted by the sack of Rome. The period before the sack was a time of flourishing scholarly activity, particularly under popes like Julius II, Leo X, who supported humanism, art, and learning. Here's why Aldus and Erasmus had such an advantage, and how much of an advantage they had over scholars who came after the sack of Rome. So the advantages that were before the sack of Rome was the access to manuscripts and libraries. So both Erasmus and Aldus had access to manuscripts and libraries in their prime states. Okay. The Vatican Library, along with other important Roman libraries, was filled with priceless manuscripts of classical authors, church fathers, and early biblical texts. Scholars working in Rome before the sack had opportunities to examine, copy, and study rare manuscripts in their original languages, including Greek and Latin. So who's the best Greek and Latin scholar of the age? Erasmus. After the sack, many of these collections were looted, lost, or dispersed. Some manuscripts were taken by the soldiers, others were hidden or destroyed, and the intellectual atmosphere of Rome was shattered. Scholars working after the sack would have faced much more difficulty accessing these materials. Scholarly networks were also affected. So before the sack, Rome was a hub for humanists, theologians, artists, and intellectuals. Erasmus and Aldus were able to engage with a vibrant community of scholars who were exchanging ideas, debating classical and theological texts, and pushing the boundaries of Renaissance thought. Aldus Manutius, in particular, was known for his printing house in Venice and his circle of humanist scholars, but his exposure to Roman scholars and patrons helped shape his work. After the sack, this scholarly community of Rome was dispersed. Many intellectuals fled the city, and the climate of fear and instability hampered the type of intellectual collaboration that had previously thrived. Post-sack scholars didn't have access to the same networks or the lively, flourishing environment that pre-sack scholars enjoyed. And so the papacy, particularly under Julius X and Julius II and Leo X, was a key patron of the arts and scholarship. Erasmus and Aldus benefited from a period where popes and cardinals were willing to invest significant resources in collecting, copying, and preserving manuscripts, as well as supporting scholarly work. The Medici popes, in particular, were known for their support of humanism, and they funded scholars like Erasmus. After the sack, the church was financially weakened. The focus shifted from cultural patronage to the rebuilding and defending its authority. Financial support for scholars became scarcer, and the sack accelerated the decline of Rome as the cultural heart of the Renaissance. So Erasmus's stay in Rome exposed him to the finest libraries and manuscripts in the world at that time. This access greatly benefited his work on the Greek New Testament, which became a cornerstone for later Reformation-era scholars. Erasmus was able to lay hands on manuscripts of the New Testament and the Church Fathers, giving him an immense advantage in producing his critical editions of these texts. So by the time the sack happened, Erasmus had already laid much of the groundwork for his Novum Instrumentum, the first published edition of the Greek New Testament in 1516. Well before Rome's intellectual resources were compromised, scholars working after 1527 would have struggled to find the same depth of resources that Erasmus enjoyed. So Aldus Manutius, the Venetian printer, was not based primarily in Rome, but his work was deeply influenced by the Renaissance humanism that thrived there before the sack. His printing house produced critical editions of the Greek and Latin classics, including important biblical texts. His advantage lay in the fact that he could collaborate with scholars who had studied in Rome and who had access to the Vatican's manuscripts collections. The sack disrupted the flow of manuscripts that had supported scholars like Aldus, making it harder for printers and scholars after the sack to access the same wealth of textual material. The disruption to the Roman libraries meant that later editions of classical and biblical text would be slower and more difficult to produce, and their accuracy might suffer without access to key manuscripts. So scholars and theologians working after the sack of Rome had to contend with some major disadvantages. So listen to this. Many manuscripts were lost or scattered around Europe, often ending up in private collections. This made it much more difficult for scholars to gather comprehensive sources for their studies, particularly in biblical studies. Rome was no longer the undisputed intellectual capital of Europe after the sack. Scholars and artists began to gravitate to other cities like Venice or Florence. But the dispersal of Rome's intellectual community made collaboration more difficult. After the sack, the papacy was more concerned with its political survival and combating the Protestant Reformation than promoting humanist scholarship. This shift meant less funding for scholars and less interest in critical biblical scholarship of the type Erasmus had championed. So basically, Erasmus and Aldus Manutius enjoyed significant advantages from their time studying and working in Italy before the sack of Rome. They had access to manuscripts, scholarly networks, financial support that would become far more difficult to come by after 1527. Scholars who came after the sack faced a much more challenging intellectual landscape with fewer resources, greater fragmentation of knowledge, and a decline in Rome's role as a center of learning. The timing of Erasmus and Aldus's work was key, allowing them to make contributions to biblical and classical scholarship that might not have been possible in the chaotic aftermath of the sack of Rome. Erasmus benefited from his time in Rome, gaining access to manuscripts that allowed him to produce critical editions of biblical texts, including his Novum Instrumentum, the first published Greek New Testament edition. By the time of the sack, he had already laid much of his groundwork. Unlike scholars after 1527 who faced significant challenges finding similar resources, Aldus, so while he was mostly in Venice, he was influenced by the Renaissance humanism that thrived in Rome after the sack, and so he benefited by Rome having a lot of scholarship there, and through his channels. And so we read in Erasmus's books, his personal sort of memoirs. We read clearly that Aldus had access to Greek scholars. Erasmus was part of the Byzantine school, who they had up to 40 Greek scholars. Aldus had a bunch of Greeks working for him in his print shop. And so the revival of Greek was mostly through people like Aldus, who was printing a lot of Greek material. And there was up to 5,000 Greek documents in Rome about the time of, was it 1505, I think it was? I can't remember exactly. I've got it on my website. And like, not all of them were biblical, but that just shows you the scholarship. People were looking at this. People were learning Greek. People were studying this. Complutensian guys were doing their text. Erasmus was doing his thing. And then Rome was destroyed, you know. So it's quite an interesting epoch of history. Okay. So yeah, like, you know, we've seen the destruction of biblical manuscripts before. English Reformation, as I mentioned, Henry VIII, when he established the Church of England, it led to the destruction of numerous texts, the burning of manuscripts. Many religious texts, especially those associated with Catholicism, were burnt as heretical. But sometimes, even though they're linked to Catholicism, they can contain certain information. You know, like, we can still look at some early Gnostic readings and go, well, okay, well, but they're quoting this verse here in an old sense, you know, but if it's destroyed, you just simply don't have access to that. So even, you know, biblical manuscripts, devotional texts and things like that were destroyed in that period of Henry VIII. The emphasis on producing English translations of the Bible, like the Great Bible, led to the devaluation and destruction of Latin manuscripts, which were no longer in favor. And so between 1538 and 1541, Henry VIII dissolved monasteries across England, resulting in the loss of countless manuscripts housed in these institutions. Many manuscripts were destroyed or sold off, further contributing to the fragmentation of biblical scholarship. So, as I mentioned, Erasmus was also in England for several years before this happened. So it's quite important to know this. So the Protestant Reformation, which began around 1517, led to significant turmoil across Europe, particularly in Germany, Switzerland, and France. The iconoclasts, they were going through and, you know, smashing idols and things like this. In many Protestant regions, there were waves of iconoclasm, where religious images, altars, and even manuscripts deemed idolatrous were destroyed. Calvinist groups, for example, often targeted images and texts they viewed as superstitious or contrary to their interpretation of Christianity. Conflicts and wars. The Reformation spurred conflicts such as the 30-Year War, which began in 1618. During these conflicts, libraries and churches were ransacked, resulting in the loss of many religious texts and manuscripts. Both Catholic and Protestant factions destroyed texts belonging to the opposite side. And as we discussed earlier, you know, the sack of Rome, 1527, had a profound impact in the preservation of biblical manuscripts. The looting and destruction of the Vatican Library and other collections meant that numerous important manuscripts, including biblical texts, were lost forever. Like the Spanish Inquisition, established in the late 15th century, intensified its efforts throughout the 16th century. They censored books, they burnt books. The Inquisition targeted many texts deemed heretical, including translations of the Bible that strayed from the Vulgate. The Spanish authorities burnt manuscripts and books that did not align to Catholic orthodoxy, severely impacting biblical scholarship in Spain and the broader Catholic world. There are also the French wars. Late 16th century saw intense religious conflicts between in France between the Catholics and the Huguenots, or the Protestants. The destruction of texts happened during these years as many libraries were destroyed. Manuscripts belonging to opposite factions were lost. Churches and religious institutions were often targeted, leading to the loss of numerous biblical texts. So across Europe, the early 16th century was marked by significant political and religious upheaval that resulted in the destruction of biblical manuscripts Events like the English Reformation, Protestant Reformation, the sack of Rome, the Spanish Inquisition, the French wars of religion all contributed to a tragic loss of biblical texts. These actions not only diminished the availability of important manuscripts, but also complicated the study and interpretation of biblical texts for generations to come. So when James White is saying we've got manuscripts today, so we're looking at another 500 years later after all this, we've got manuscripts today, and we're going to go with them. It's like, well, what about all the stuff that's been lost? It's like, why did Erasmus choose that reading? Well, he must have had a bad day and spilled his coffee, or no, he probably just had access to a whole bunch of manuscripts that you don't know about because they're lost in history. So the Complutensian Polyglot, which was produced in the early 16th century under the patronage of Cardinal Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, was a significant work that aimed to provide a comprehensive biblical text in multiple languages: Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Aramaic. The sack of Rome in 1527 had a substantial impact on the preservation of manuscripts in Rome, including those housed in the Vatican Library. Although the Complutensian Polyglot itself was printed in Alcalá de Henares in Spain, it relied heavily on manuscripts that could have originated from or been influenced by those available in Rome and the Vatican. The Vatican Library held numerous manuscripts that contributed to biblical scholarship at the time. If any of those manuscripts were lost during the sack, it could have affected scholars' access to source materials, including those used for the Complutensian Polyglot. Fortunately, the Complutensian Polyglot was completed and published in 1522. So I'm pretty sure it was 1517. The Old Testament section was finished, but it was published in 1522. So before the sack of Rome occurred. However, the event's aftermath did contribute to the broader cultural and scholarly disruption of in Europe, which would have long-term effects on biblical scholarship. The destruction of manuscripts during the sack further emphasized the fragility of biblical texts in the importance of preserving them. The Complutensian Polyglot represented an effort to consolidate and preserve biblical texts in the wake of such turmoil, reflecting a renewed interest in critical scholarship despite the challenges posed by events like the sack of Rome. Overall, while the Complutensian Polyglot itself was published before the sack, the loss of other manuscripts during this time highlighted the vulnerabilities faced by scholars and manuscripts they relied on. So during the time of Erasmus, Minucius, Martin Luther, the Vatican Library did not have a formal systematic record-keeping method for who visited the library. However, some historical records do exist and mention prominent scholars and visitors to the library of that era. There are informal accounts and correspondence from that period that mention visits by notable figures, but these are not comprehensive or consistent. Erasmus himself wrote about his visits and interactions with various scholars, which gives some insight into the intellectual environment of the time. The Vatican Library did maintain catalogues of its manuscripts, which sometimes included notes about who accessed certain texts. However, these records primarily focus on the contents of the library rather than a detailed list of all visitors. Some documents and letters from that period have survived, detailing the work of scholars and their interactions with the library. Still, there is no complete visitor log as we would expect today. Okay. So today, the Vatican Library does have extensive archives, including records related to the library's collections, acquisitions, and significant events. However, finding a specific visitor list from the early 16th century is unlikely. Most surviving documentation focuses more on the manuscripts and scholarly activities rather than visitor attendance. So while some historical references to visitors exist, there isn't a comprehensive list of visitors to the Vatican Library during the time of Erasmus, Minucius, Luther, etc. The records that do exist provide insight into the intellectual climate of that era, but do not serve as a formal visitor log. So Erasmus's time in Rome, particularly his interactions with the Vatican Library, is well documented through his letters and his writings. So while the Vatican don't have the visitors list and Erasmus turned up on this day, well, Erasmus clearly talks about what he did and didn't do. There isn't a comprehensive record of every visit or manuscript that he encountered. Several pieces of evidence illustrate his activities and experiences during that time. Letters of correspondence often talk about the evidence of Erasmus in Rome and at the Vatican Library. Erasmus's correspondence contains numerous references to his experiences in Rome. In his letters, he often discusses his admiration for the city, its culture, and the intellectual climate. For example, in his letter to English scholar John Colet, Erasmus expresses his delight in visiting Rome and mentions his plan to study various manuscripts. So, I mean, to me, this is just a kick in the guts to the critical text guys, because many times they are just saying, Erasmus, he never, would have gone and seen Vaticanus, why not? Why wouldn't he have seen that? I'm sure that he would have gone into that library and that he would have been seen as a distinguished guest. He would have been, like I said, it's like having a science fair and Albert Einstein shows up. He would have been like the main guy, He also wrote to his friend Thomas More about the lively discussions he had with other scholars in Rome, highlighting the city's role as a center of humanist thought. Erasmus published his collection of proverbs, the Adagia, during his time in Rome. His work reflects his engagement with classical text and the scholarly environment he found there. He likely had access to the Vatican Library's resources, which would have been invaluable for his studies, because, it was 10, 15, 20 years later, Rome was sacked, and a lot of those manuscripts were destroyed. Although he didn't keep a detailed diary, Erasmus likely visited the Vatican Library to examine manuscripts relevant to his work. This is what he did throughout the rest of the world, wherever he went. When he was in Paris, he visited the libraries, he looked at manuscripts. When he was in England, he did the same. When he was in Venice, he did the same. So why wouldn't he do this in Rome, except for the fact that people want to reconstruct a history and say, well, Erasmus never did that. It's just a critical text argument that people like James White or Jan Kranz want to make, and it's just simply something that they can't validate that. And it's like saying Beckham, who's a famous soccer player, like he played soccer in this country, but when he went to one of the major soccer countries, like say Italy, he never played soccer there. And it's like, well, it doesn't say that he didn't, and he actually, why wouldn't he? You know what I mean? Like, but that just gets in the way of their story. So they have a Textus Receptus, an anti-Textus Receptus narrative, and they want to stick to it, and they don't want these pesky facts to get in the way. And oftentimes I'll say things like this, just looking at the facts, looking at the stats, looking at history, and then usually some sort of strange and bizarre and weird anecdote comes up. And I've often, in my jesting, in my joking, said that perhaps, Erasmus walking up the Vatican steps and this green gas, like, a Batman episode appeared, and he just fainted and then fell on the ground for a few hours and got up and went, I can't go in there. For some reason, history won't let me in there. This green gas just keeps turning up and I keep fainting. I mean, that's how ridiculous some of these stories are about Erasmus. Why wouldn't he go to the Vatican Library? It's just because they have this narrative and they want to stick to it. He mingled with other scholars while he's in Rome, prominent humanists and church officials. His letters indicate he was engaged with discussions about theology, classical literature, and biblical texts, which would have taken place in part at the Vatican Library or in scholarly circles nearby. And so in his work, The Praise of Folly, published shortly after his time in Rome, Erasmus reflects on the state of the church and the need for reform. While this work does not directly describe his library activities, it illustrates the intellectual environment of Rome that influenced his thinking. During his time in Rome, Erasmus focused on several key activities: studying manuscripts. So this is what Erasmus did. This is his life. He examined various manuscripts, likely including biblical texts and works of classical authors. His texts in Rome allowed him to deepen his understanding of Greek and Latin, which would later inform his critical decisions on the New Testament. Erasmus built connections with other humanists and scholars, participating in discussions that fostered the exchange of ideas. His networking was crucial for his later work in biblical scholarship. Erasmus was critical of certain practices within the church, and his time in Rome exposed him to the realities of church life, informing his views on the need of reform. He continued to write and publish during his time in Rome, contributing to the humanist movement and laying the groundwork for his later intellectual and influential works. Erasmus, his evidence of being in Rome, particularly regarding the Vatican Library, primarily comes from his letters and published works. He actively engaged in studying manuscripts, networking with other scholars, and reflecting on the church's state during a transformative period of history. Although specific records of his exact activities in the Vatican Library are scarce, his writings demonstrate the significant impact of his time in Rome on his scholarship and thought. So Erasmus's relationship with Codex Vaticanus, one of the oldest and most important biblical manuscripts according to the critical text side, is somewhat indirectly but noteworthy in the context of his scholarship. So he was aware of this manuscript. Erasmus in 1535 basically claimed that this manuscript was a bit of a nothing, and he felt that it had been amended according to a Latin text, and it was amended about 100 years earlier. Erasmus was aware of the significance of Codex Vaticanus, but there's no direct evidence to confirm that he examined it personally while in Rome, but there's also no evidence that he did not examine it personally while in Rome. So Codex Vaticanus is considered an important witness of the Septuagint and the New Testament. So critical text scholars have exalted Codex Vaticanus to be their darling. It is the best text that they have. So although they talk about Sinaiticus, most of the time they are going to Vaticanus readings. This is what Westcott and Hort did. Okay, so it's possible that Erasmus may have had access to Codex Vaticanus in Rome. So, I mean, you're talking about the main scholar of Latin, the main scholar of Greek. He's going around Europe scouring libraries for Bible manuscripts, and he's at the Vatican. Why wouldn't he look at everything? It just doesn't make sense to me. It just seems like a barrier that's been put up there. It's sort of like it's like saying the story of the four lepers when they went down into the camp of the Syrians, and the Syrians fled thinking it was an army, And they went inside the tents and they're just eating all this food and everything. And they felt like, hang on, there's a whole city starving, and they went and told them, and they came out and got the food. It's like saying, well, they ate the food there, but they didn't touch the apples. How do you know that? how? And imagine if just people just kept repeating this story. Eventually, people just think, well, yeah, they didn't touch the apples. You know, why wouldn't Erasmus, who is looking for biblical manuscripts, looking for old biblical manuscripts, that's what he's there for. He's going to do a Bible. He's had that on his heart and mind for 20 years. But he goes to the Vatican Library and just goes, I can't go into that corner and look at this manuscript because I guess there's a green gas there. Or maybe there was a big spider on the wall, or a snake, or a crocodile. Maybe there was a dinosaur. Maybe there was a unicorn there, you know. I mean, well, it just doesn't make historical sense. So the Codex, it was already well known among scholars at the time that Erasmus was there. So why wouldn't he have seen it? So anyway, I'm just going to summarize this, okay? So before the sack of Rome, Rome was a major center of scholarship and housed many manuscripts, including works from the classical period and early Christian writings. While exact numbers are hard to pinpoint, it is believed that the Vatican Library contains several thousand manuscripts. Some estimates suggest that the library held between 12 and 20,000 manuscripts at that time. But after the sack of Rome, this resulted in significant destruction and looting, including the loss of many manuscripts. It's estimated that thousands of manuscripts were destroyed, stolen, or lost in this period. Some scholars believe as many as half of the manuscripts in libraries could have been lost or damaged. Half. While specific data on the exact number of manuscripts lost is scarce, it is widely acknowledged that the sack had a profound impact on the preservation and availability of textual manuscripts in Rome. The Vatican Library faced extensive losses, and many important texts that could have influenced biblical scholarship were likely lost. So in summary, so this is the conclusion of this episode. While precise numbers are difficult to establish, the contrast between the rich manuscript culture before the sack of Rome and the significant losses occurred during the event highlights and its impact on the preservation of knowledge and texts. The event underscored the fragility of manuscripts collected during times of political upheaval. I think I missed a word there. The contrast between the rich manuscript culture before the sack of Rome and the significant losses incurred during the event highlights its impact on the preservation of knowledge and text. So I think you can see why 1527 is a very important year. And for us who are looking oftentimes at Erasmus, when we're looking at, say, the debate of, Jeff Riddle, why did Erasmus use this manuscript where it has oikonomia in most manuscripts, but you have koinonia in, there's only one manuscript. Or James White said there's no manuscripts that have it. But then we found a manuscript with it, and it's like, oh, there's one manuscript. Then we found another one. Oh, there's two. Oh, there's three. Or actually, one of the papyri sort of has a half reading. It can go either way. And so the more we look, the more evidence we find. But are we just dealing with fragmentary evidence? It's a bit like when you open up an old puzzle game and you just sort of think to yourself, am I going to put 5,000 pieces of the puzzle on the table and there's going to be, 15 pieces missing, or has someone actually tipped in from another puzzle a whole bunch of other puzzle pieces in here, and we're going to have an extra 400 pieces? Is it worth me going back and trying to reconstruct all this? But this is what the critical text is doing. They're reconstructing their text with fragmentary evidence, and oftentimes they're rejecting the work done by the Complutensian scholars, by Erasmus, the scholars in that era who had access to things that the critical text guys of today will never have access to. And so I think that the 1527 date is something that we need to keep in our mind as a time where there was a huge paradigm shift. Just as much as we talk about the fall of Constantinople, just as much as we talk about the Great Fire of London, just as much as we talk about World War II and the loss of biblical manuscripts, 1527, up to half of the biblical manuscripts in Rome vanished, were gone. They're just no longer in existence. And so before I shut this down, I'll just quickly check a few of these things, because there was a few other things I was looking at. And I recommend going to Wikipedia and just reading through some of this. There is an article on the Roman Renaissance. And so, but yeah, it basically says 1527 was the end of that Renaissance. The looting of the city after the sack of 1527, the brutal sack. So this is Wikipedia. This is not my, this is not something I've made up. This is not something that, I'm just saying because I'm a Textus Receptus guy and I'm just pushing a barrow. The brutal sack of Rome in 1527 by the troops of the Emperor Charles V brought the Roman High Renaissance to an abrupt end. Some artists were killed, and most of the rest fled to other cities, as did the patrons in the Curia. When the artistic activity revived, it was mostly in the Mannerist style. The so-called counter-Mannerist style was a reaction to the Mannerist excesses, supported by several patrons around the mid-century. And so they're talking about with plainer and more naturalist depictions in the spirit of the Counter-Reformation, talking about the artwork had even changed. Rome once again became a driving center of art at the end of the century, and so it took about 100 years for them to sort of get their act back together. So very interesting article on the sack of Rome here and the Roman Renaissance, the sack of Rome. So basically the article Roman Renaissance here, you read through it, and the very last section, it goes through, Julius II, we talked about Pope Leo X. The last section is sack of Rome. And then the article finishes. That in itself shows you the importance of this date. That in itself shows you the intellectuals, many of them were killed. The manuscripts, many of them were destroyed. The artists, many of them fled, were killed. And so everything changed. So obviously people who had access to Rome at the peak of the Renaissance, which is before this date, they had an advantage. And that's why the text of Erasmus, the text of Aldus, these guys had access to things that they don't have access today. No matter where Dan Wallace goes and takes photos and all the rest of it, there are just things that will no longer be known. The 5,000 Greek manuscripts that were in that were in Rome at this time, the 5,000 Greek manuscripts, not all of them biblical, but Greek documents, how many of them just went missing as well? And so this is something that that every defender of the Textus Receptus needs to get their mind around. And I think that this is going to be something that's brought up quite a lot in our defense, in our debates, specifically when we're looking at some of the readings of Erasmus, because sometimes we go through and we're looking at Beza and we're saying, okay, well, Beza's got this reading and that reading, and usually they're talking about, you know, why they've got that. We're looking at Stephanus, you know, he's got a list of manuscripts, you know, that he had access to. But when we look at Erasmus, sometimes we're at a bit of a loss and we're like, well, why did he choose that? Perhaps if he had seen a ton of manuscripts with those readings in it in Rome, they're collected there, they're compiled there, and then they're destroyed. That can be a huge driving force. So instead of, you know, only just having, you know, 4 or 5 manuscripts of the reading like Koinonia, perhaps there was 20, perhaps there was 30, perhaps there were old manuscripts, perhaps there were early church writings, documents that had readings that Erasmus was utilizing. So the sack of Rome is a very important event on the calendar. I would recommend people go through these videos here. There was another one I looked at. I might just type in sack of Rome, actually, because there is the 1410 sack of Rome. We can get mixed up. But if we type in this search bar, which it won't let me go into, let's type it into Google. I did watch another one. Okay, well, we'll just go to YouTube. I think I watched this one. Yeah, I did. This one was interesting as well. I had quite a lot of pictures. 1527 sack of Rome. Yeah, there's a lot of these type of historical documentaries on the sack of Rome, and some of them are so well done. So yeah, there we go. There's heaps of information, but I don't think many people have put the 2 and 2 together and mentioned the advantage that Aldous and Erasmus and the scholars that they had access to, and also the Complutensian scholars, because they borrowed from the Vatican Library, the advantages that these people had. And so they obviously would have superior readings rather than just fragmentary readings with the crumbs that are left. Boulder's Lion is saying brutal and says, I'm loving this study series on the Byzantine school. Thanks for being so thorough, Nick. That's why I watch you. I'm enjoying it too, because oftentimes I'm thinking outside of the box like this, and then I'll interview someone or I'll do another program and just 2 things meet. The whole concept of Erasmus not seeing Vaticanus, it just never made much sense to me. And I guess the more that I've pursued that and pushed back on that, I think it's opened a few people's eyes to go, yeah, well, how come we're believing this story? Who made this story up, And also the fact that Erasmus had access to manuscripts in the UK, in England, because he was hanging around the top scholarship of the day as well, in England, in Paris, in Rotterdam, in Venice, in Rome. So he's hanging around the top scholars. He's in contact with all these scholars. These guys have access to all these manuscripts. And then periods of time happen, like the sack of Rome, the wars in Germany, the Protestant Reformation in England. So some of these documents go missing or get destroyed, especially the most valuable ones. But Erasmus was able, he lived at a time before these things happened, and he had access to a lot of these things. And so I'm enjoying just thinking outside of the box of what we've got today. The extant manuscripts that we hold in our hand today are pretty much all we have to deal with. That's God's providence. God's providence is the manuscripts that we hold in our hands today. No, God's providence is the fact that a manuscript can be just completely destroyed, but God writes it down on in a printed form through Erasmus or through Aldous or through other writers of that period. So then when Stephanus comes along and Beza comes along and the King James guys come along, they have access to basically the Vatican Library before the sack of Rome through these authors. So that's where we have an advantage, because we're going back before these instances happened, where people who are only looking at what they have in their hand today, they're at a disadvantage because they're dealing with fragmentary material. Erasmus lived and breathed everything manuscript. It was his life. Yes. This was my favorite part of this series so far. Because I actually thought about this about 3 weeks ago, but I was in Pakistan. I was going to do the video, but see, my setup here at home, I've got 2 screens at my laptop. And I just found just doing stuff on my laptop, I didn't have a mouse, I didn't have a keyboard. I was just like, man, I'm going to struggle. And the internet's not that good there. The power can go off at any time. So I'll just wait until I get home, or else I'm going to do half a show, and it's going to. And the thing is, too, I'm in a house with like 13 other people. Your kids are screaming, running around, and there's just mosques in the background, chanting, and I'm just like, man, I don't think I'm going to get a video done here. So Matt Singleton is in the house. Hey, Matt, I saw your text earlier. Sometimes I look at your text and it's like 5 a.m. and I've just sort of got up to use the bathroom or something, and I'm like, oh, I won't start a conversation just yet. I'll go back to bed, So, but yeah, we'll definitely have to get together and do something on the Roman Catholics. That would be an interesting thing to do. And I've got Nehemiah Gordon coming on. I know I've been saying that for weeks and weeks before I went to Pakistan, but he contacted me and said, let's do it this week. So I'm like, cool. He got COVID. That's why he couldn't do it before I left. And so that's going to be an interesting thing. That's going to take up a fair bit of my time this week, as I'm going to be pretty busy. But we will definitely organize something to fit in and squeeze in that conversation about the Roman Catholics. So Matt says, yes, I'm really excited. I think I may have new insights, but as much as has been written, yeah. Well, sometimes too, there's knowledge out there. It's just not popular. It's sometimes you listen to someone and it's like, actually, I've heard that before, but that's sort of profound. People need to know that more. And that's what I like with doing these Byzantine Academy series, or the Byzantine School series, is just focusing on the people around, like Erasmus, like Aldous. We're going to focus on people like Cardinal Bessarion. We're going to look at Lorenzo Valla, a whole bunch of other people who were involved with this period of time and what they had access to. Because some of these guys had access to manuscripts and readings before the fall of Constantinople. And we understand the importance of that. But this is just as important. This is the sack of Rome. It's people who had access, because sometimes what was brought over to Rome through people like Bessarion, through people like Valla, the type of readings and things that they had are sort of lost in history. But thankfully Bessarion, he kept his manuscripts, he donated them to a museum in Venice. So Cardinal Bessarion. Okay, here we go. So we're going to look more at Bessarion, because I think my gut feeling is that Erasmus and Aldus had access to his material. Okay, so he lived from 1403 to 1472. So we're looking at 40 years before Erasmus was working with Aldus, okay, in his print shop. But we can see that because he had an interesting influence in 1439 at the Council of Florence as well. His works are okay. It was thanks to him that the Bibliotheca, an important compendium of Greek mythology, has survived to the present. His library, which contained a very extensive collection of Greek manuscripts, was presented by him in 1468 to the Senate and Republic of Venice, and forms the nucleus of the famous Library of St. Mark's, Bibliotheca Marciana. It comprised of 482 Greek and 264 Latin manuscripts. And so, I mean, that's something that I really want to look into, because this is in Venice, Italy. So where did Erasmus live? With Aldus, who's printing Greek and Latin manuscripts. They're in Venice. I mean, back then, Venice wasn't like New York. You know, we're looking at, you know, a smaller population, probably 20,000. Well, it could be more, you know, whatever. But they would have known about this. This would have been something that would have been studied and thought about. Okay, so this has a huge number of manuscripts nowadays. But so, yeah, this was founded by Bessarion. And so, yeah, he's writing before and after the fall of Constantinople. And yeah, this will just be something very interesting to look into, to see whether, because that was one of the things I asked Heffen Jones. I said, you know, I was asking him about this, and it just sort of clicked. Well, if he's got this library that he's donated to here in Venice, surely Erasmus and Aldus would have had access to it. And I could see him going, yeah, but that means that the whole story of Erasmus only had access to like 5 manuscripts or 6 manuscripts or 12 manuscripts or 20. No, he could have had access to hundreds and hundreds. And if he went to the Vatican Library, he had access to hundreds. If he went to this place, which I'm sort of, I don't know whether to call it a library or a museum, but if he went there, he had access to at least 500. And so, I mean, that just blows these numbers out of the water. I mean, books should be revised. Anyone studying textual criticism or doing apologetics will have to stop saying that Erasmus only had access to like 3 or 4 manuscripts, or, you know, I think it's Dan Wallace who keeps saying 5 manuscripts, and the King James is only based upon 5 manuscripts. It's like, so I'm just looking for this. Okay, so that's going to go right into other scholars there. But maybe, okay, or I guess we can look at the history of the Vatican Library. That would be very interesting. So there's a whole bunch of very interesting things that we can look at. And what we want to do is we want to become experts on these issues. We want to become, so when someone says, well, you know, Erasmus didn't have access to, you know, more than 6 manuscripts or 10 manuscripts or whatever, we're like, hang on, what about the Vatican Library? And it's like, oh, he never went to the Vatican Library. And then it's like, well, we don't know that Erasmus has this reading. Where did it come from? It's like, well, 1527, the sack of Rome. We can explain it to people. So sometimes people just don't know history, and that's what I'm finding is oftentimes you're dealing with people who just sort of they just think history's been smooth. Obviously the sack of Rome is like it's like a Holocaust. It's a pretty bad time. So anyway, I'm just sort of doom scrolling through here just out of interest. So I think what I'll do, I'll shut this down. Boulder's Lion says, keep thinking outside of the box and stay blessed, Nick. Yes, thanks for that encouragement. And if there's anything else you guys want me to study about, I've probably got 10 things up my sleeve with these. Bessarion, Lorenzo Valla, there's other epochs of time, but we're specifically dealing with the Byzantine era. So that's, the Byzantine era leaking out from Constantinople into Italy, into Europe, and then what happened then? Because we base our Textus Receptus the basis of that is the Byzantine text. So we want to sort of clear up that era of when things started to get printed, why certain readings came into the text, and we want to sort of become familiar with that. And so I guess even looking at Erasmus, his time in England, that would be an interesting one to look at, or his, time in other places. He was in Paris for quite a while. What did he have access to there? Is there documentation? Even just looking at his books, I've got so many books on Erasmus. Actually, I won't go into them now because I'll just end up going through my hard drives and looking for stuff. But I think, if there's anything that, triggers your mind and you're thinking, well, sort of thinking outside of the box and what about this and what about that? Just leave it in the comments and we can work on it. Even just studying the Renaissance, there's a lot in that. Well, okay, guys, God bless you. Thanks for joining us. I'll play my fancy little outro, and we'll see you again next time.